Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Sorry for the little sort of awkward silence there. But last time we hadn't allocated enough time between sessions for discussion and questions. And maybe this time people are feeling more apprehensive, more unsure about what it is that they might or might not be doing, and therefore a bit more reluctant to speak about that. But we don't want to do the talks early in case people are particularly interested in particular segments, because it means that they will miss it. So thanks very much for that introduction, Georgia. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about what happens to benefits in a pandemic. So we've done a series of what happens to pay in a pandemic. So we've done 3 surveys specifically examining pay increases, furlough, CJRS, and other elements relating to pay, what employers have been doing. The first one we did very early in the pandemic in, I think it was about April, May. Then we did another one about June, July time when the CJRS changed. And then we've just done another series in November. We've had a lot about benefits, so we thought we need to do something on benefits as well. So we thought let's expand the series and ask what happens to benefits in a pandemic. I'm going to focus, I'm going to look really at how benefits have been affected by the pandemic and the surge in home working, and I'm going to focus on 2 areas this morning. Firstly, how benefits and the benefits agenda has changed since the start of 2020. And secondly, I'm going to talk to you about some sort of key themes as we go into 2021 from our research. So starting off, we're going to look at some key trends in benefits from our research and looking at how benefits and the benefits agenda has changed since the start of 2020. So our research on benefits over the last 10 months indicates that, like pay and pay increases, benefits have also been affected by the pandemic. And today I'm going to talk to you about 2 key trends that our research has identified. The first is that we've seen more employers actually improving their reward offering than reducing it, which perhaps seems counterintuitive, but we'll talk about what shape that's taken next. And secondly, that wellbeing initiatives have taken centre stage. That's firmly on the reward agenda and the benefits agenda in 2020, and it will continue into 2021. So looking first at changes to reward packages. So this data comes from our Pay in a Pandemic Phase 3 research, which we conducted in November and December 2019. It had responses from 69 firms, majority of which are large private sector firms. And you can see the chart that what I show here, and that's provided in the pack, shows the proportion of employers of the 69 that have told us whether they've improved or reduced the reward package since the early part of 2020. So the first column we can see is clearly the tallest, and that is improvements have been made to the reward package, and 34% of employers have told us that they have made some form of improvement to their reward package, benefits package, since March 2020. So the sorts of things that we're looking at here, the sorts of things that we've seen and monitored, are improvements focusing on enhancing or extending sick pay. So this typically takes the form of levelling the playing field for lower paid staff who were previously only covered by statutory sick pay. So the rules around self-isolating, staying away from work, all the measures that have been introduced by the government and health departments to try and slow the spread of coronavirus have obviously resulted in more people needing time off work, and many lowest paid staff, hourly paid staff, are covered by statutory provisions, whereas their counterpart in the white collar or salaried positions would receive company sick paid. So where we've seen improvements, it's been employers trying to redress that balance. Not necessarily matching the provision in both cases, but certainly lifting the statutory staff and giving them some form of company sick pay. which obviously serves the purpose of improving the benefits package, but also it helps curtail any major outbreaks because there's no disincentive to stay off work. So that's on sick pay. The other area we've seen improvements has been around time off and additional holidays. This has taken the shape of either greater flexibility about having time off and when hours are worked, etc., and flexibility around holidays, or more paid care leave. Obviously, where we had the schools closed last spring for that period, and now the fact that they're closed again, we've seen employers making improvements there. And finally, in some sectors, not all, but in some sectors, there have been some additional allowances for working during the pandemic. And these have been concentrated in retail. So we've sort of coined this term saying it's extra hazard pay for a certain period. Although I must say, in many cases, these initiatives were implemented quite early in the pandemic and they've since been taken away. We've got quite a few examples of these. So some of the largest in retailers, we can see Aldi have paid a 10% bonus. B&M's have given 1 week of extra pay to around 30,000 of its store staff. Wickes has given staff an extra day's holiday in recognition of the additional work that they've done during the pandemic, extra pressure, extra workloads and difficult circumstances. Both Sainsbury's and Tesco's have had 10% additions. In Tesco, they implemented the 10% extra for a 6-week period between March and April to recognise staff efforts. And again, at Christmas, they added an extra 10% to hours worked over the Christmas period. So that's what we've seen in terms of improvements. In terms of reductions, 24% have told us that they reduced the reward package since March 2020. Mainly these relate to pay cuts, usually temporary, and reductions in bonuses. I was going to spend a couple of minutes just talking about pay cuts specifically, because I know that's always of key interest when we hit a recession. So in the pandemic survey, we also asked employers whether they'd had an increase or downturn in trade. And then those with a downturn, we specifically asked them about pay cuts. And we found that of the organisations that reported a downturn in trade, 2/5 have introduced a pay cut. The vast majority of these, thankfully for staff, are temporary. So 5%, just 5% of the pay cuts at those organisations with the downturn say that they're permanent pay cuts, and the rest are temporary pay cuts. We've seen examples across all sectors, but they are more common in private services, such as air transport, probably not surprising. And we'd say that permanent pay cuts do remain rare, but we have seen a small uptick in the incidence of organisations looking to dismiss and re-engage staff on worse terms. So key examples we have there is British Gas is a major one. Another example that we've picked up this morning is at Go Northwest for Manchester bus drivers. They're facing a fire and rehire programme. Some of these moves on pay cuts may be genuinely based on affordability, but we feel that there could be some moves that are more opportunistic in a sense. Another move that was made was British Airways for pilots. So some of them are genuine, some of them could be, there's some taking advantage of the situation. So obviously we want to keep an eye on what happens to pay cuts as we go into next year. As Zoe alluded to earlier, a lot of the pay increases that we monitored in 2020 had already been discussed and decided before the pandemic took hold. So are we going to see more clawing back? Excuse me. Are we going to see some clawing back in 2021? We need to watch that. However, while there could be some causes for more pay cuts, more temporary pay cuts, it is possible that we might actually, that's giving a downward pressure on pay. There could be some upward pressure in some sectors by growing union organisation. So it's something we need to look out for there. A couple of pay cut examples. British Airways is one. There was EasyJet as another example. Although we also asked companies about if the pay cut was temporary or permanent, and one employer told us that they hadn't made a permanent pay cut and that they were not going to, and specifically said it is not considering it because it would directly affect staff retention. So just going back to the other reductions that we've seen, there were a couple of other changes which are less common, but we have one employer, for example, told us that it's reduced its group income protection cover for staff, and another one has told us that it's stopped overtime and also reduced pension contributions. So there are a couple of other things going on out there, thankfully not that widespread, but there are a few things happening. In this same survey, the Pay in Pandemic Phase 3 in December last year, we also asked participants to tell us about any changes they've made or are thinking of making to working time arrangements. And this showed that certain initiatives that were implemented in the early part of the pandemic have now been removed. So it shows how employers have adapted their response to the pandemic over time. So earlier on, our first pandemic survey showed that reducing staff hours was the most common approach to tackling the downturn. At that time, 32% had implemented that measure. But now we're seeing that giving voluntary unpaid leave seems to have taken over. So moving on to well-being. So this data comes from another one of our surveys. This was a survey that we undertook in December, specifically looking at well-being. Obviously, with the coronavirus pandemic, there's been a lot more pressure on everybody, a lot more stress. Work-life balance for many people has literally gone out of the window with the children at home, and maybe people don't have appropriate workspaces. Lots of additional pressures which we haven't seen before. And so we wanted to ask employers about the prevalence of a wide range of well-being related benefits. That survey received responses from 76 firms, again, mainly private sector, large private sector companies. As you can see from the chart, the most popular options at the bottom there are flexible working, first aid training, and occupational health service. So we can see around 90% of respondents have that as an offering for staff. These figures are similar or slightly higher within the manufacturing and primary sector on the one hand, but then slightly lower within private services. We can see from the chart that around 2/3 of employers make standing desks available, but this is less common in manufacturing, which I'll talk about in a second. At the other end of the scale, we can see that the least common wellbeing related benefits are those, wellness software, which are these sorts of prompts that employees have on their computers, which prompt them to take a break or to rest their eyes or etc. Just 9% of our sample report having wellness software. Sporting events don't seem to be that common either, or family days. And there's limited provision for smoking cessation support, which is offered by just 16% of respondents. This next chart provides the figures broken down by the two major segments of the private sector. So we've got the private services in purple and the manufacturing and primary section in green. And you see that I've also just summarised the most popular benefits in each segment. You can see they're fairly similar in that flexible working, first aid and occupational health feature as the top three. But you can see that health and first aid features highest in manufacturing, which probably makes sense since here is more likely to be a more hazardous environment for staff. Thereafter, we can see that in both parts, staff attitude surveys fare pretty well, with around 60% of employers telling us that they undertake a staff attitude survey. Mental health has also gained popularity, and again around 60% there, whereas the sixth most common initiatives in the two parts are quite different. On the one hand, in private services, we see standing desks, which are probably less relevant in manufacturing, whereas fundraising takes the sixth position in the manufacturing. We also found that financial well-being features as part of the well-being factor. And again, this is something relatively new. Well-being has been on the agenda. Employees' health, safety has long been on the agenda. Well-being has been taking off over the last 5 years or so, but financial well-being now seems to be a key feature of employers' reward offering as well. And the survey revealed that a sizable minority of employers have taken steps to offer some form of financial education and support for employees to help them manage their money. So across the sample, we can see around a third have told us, which is near the top, they either offer money management seminars or financial advice. And we can see that across the board, retirement funding is much more common. 53% say they run retirement funding seminars. Across the economy, only 16% of organisations allow early access to wages, and around 2/5 say they offer some form of staff loans. Although we should probably caveat that the staff loans in some cases are relating to travel loans and season ticket loans. So it's not a loan for anything, it's specifically, so it kind of overlaps with its travel benefit really. Staff discounts are obviously the most popular way to help employees make their money stretch a bit further. Around 2/5 of employers offer a discount on their own products or services, and this figure increases to around 50% and 55% when we look at the private services and manufacturing sectors separately, which I'll show you in a second. Of course, not all organisations are actually in a position to offer a discount on their products, but they sometimes offer discounts at other businesses, which they negotiate either directly or they can be obtained through a voluntary benefit scheme. The next slide, just again, as the previous one did, we're giving you a breakdown of the popularity of these financial well-being offerings by the two major parts of the private sector. And again, the private services is in purple and the manufacturing is in green. And we can see some distinction in financial well-being benefits between manufacturing and private services, most notably early access to wages and staff loans, which they're not particularly common overall, but they are much more common in manufacturing than they are in private services. Although arguably this benefit maybe even works against developing money management skills. So we can see from the chart here, staff loans, 13% in the private sector offer it, 26% in manufacturing. At the other end of the scale, retirement funding seminars are much more common in private services than they are in manufacturing, despite manufacturers often citing issues relating to an urgent ageing workforce. So here we can see 60% of our sample in the private sector say they run retirement funding seminars versus 42% in manufacturing. So I'm actually going possibly a tiny bit over, but I am just on my last slide. And finally, I'm going to talk to you briefly about the outlook for 2021. So obviously, we think the trend in wellbeing is going to continue. That's still going to play a key part of employers' benefits agenda. But the other area, we've had a lot of noise from employers asking us and questioning us about what's happening to location pay, what's happening to home working, what's happening to travel arrangements, travel allowances, etc., and other benefits. So we decided we needed to try and find out. So we have a poll in the field right this moment. It hasn't actually closed yet. So if you're interested in this area, please do take part. We can send you a free summary of the findings, which hopefully you'll find useful in your own deliberations. So So at the moment, we've got information from 58 organisations. It's very, very early, there's indicative findings. And again, they're from mainly large private sector. So far, we say there seems to be, or there is, a lot of intention around reviewing travel, location and home working benefits in light of expanded home working. And actually on home working, we asked specifically about home workers in the pay and pandemic survey that I referred to earlier, which was a sample of 69 firms conducted in November and December. That showed that 95% of respondents have home workers, and 38% of them, which is 27, I think, told us that they had implemented home working as a direct result of the pandemic. The vast majority of those also told us that they were continuing home working in 2021, and 61% intend to offer permanent home working to some or all employees, although in most cases it's undecided as to how many staff and which roles will be affected. That figure of 61% thinking of offering permanent home working was actually before the current lockdown. So it'll be interesting to see how the balance of office or site workers and home workers changes throughout 2021. So given that as the backdrop, major increase in home workers, potential plans to keep many people as home workers, what's actually happened to location pay, home working allowances and travel benefits. So far we've seen, and as I say, the survey's not closed yet, location pay is under review in a small number of cases. So in order to look at location pay, we had to ask respondents, one, whether they have staff in different locations, and two, if they do they actually have a form of location pay? Not all businesses do, some just have national pay and that's it, no additions for any particular locations. So we were left with a group of 21 firms that have staff in different locations and a location pay. Of that, half are considering changes. So 5 told us that they're thinking of removing or suspending location pay. 4 have told us that they're considering a reduction in location payments, and 3 are thinking about an increase in location payments. So it's mostly a case of no changes at the moment, but it's definitely something that's under review. And I think the fact that employers haven't moved forward with concrete changes in this area is not really a surprise, because there's a very fluid nature of the pandemic, with us in and out of lockdowns and varying restrictions. So perhaps the vaccine gives light that we are going to go back to normal. Perhaps employers are holding off at the moment, making any permanent long-term decisions, which could have an adverse effect on recruitment and retention. There's not much happening on home working allowances at the moment either, unfortunately. Well, not unfortunately, but we would have liked to have had more specific examples to look at. But we have found that most employers are simply revisiting their existing expenses policy to enable staff at home to order the equipment and stationery that we need. 3 have implemented a permanent change to their policy, 10 have implemented a temporary change, and 5 are considering changing their expenses policy and HR rules around claiming money. Most employers say that they are sort of actively promoting the HMRC tax allowance for home workers, but there's very little movement in terms of new home working allowances. We've got 10 employers tell us that they're considering introducing a new allowance. 3 have done so, but only on a temporary basis. There've been no permanent changes here as yet, so no new permanent home working allowances as yet, but we are continuing to monitor that. Finally, we asked about changes to company car or car allowances, cycle to work schemes, season ticket loans, and free or subsidised transport. So far, we've only seen the temporary suspension of cycle to work schemes and season ticket loans in a couple of cases. At this point, cars and car allowances are unchanged, but the picture could change. So we're going to continue looking at benefits, and I do encourage you to complete the survey if you have time. That's me come to an end.